Iran first developed a constitution more than 100 years ago. There are countries in the Middle East that even to this day do not have a constitution. Iran has been having political parties and elections and parliaments ever since then. The elections haven't always been fair and free. The constitution hasn't always been followed, unlike here. But politics is something that Iranians very much understand. In the period after the Second World War, when the old dictator Reza Shah was gone, democracy suddenly exploded. The promise of the 1906 constitutional revolution was fulfilled. Iran became a democracy. They had free elections in the late 40s and early 50s and produced a leader who embodied what Iranians wanted. That was Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. So his program essentially had two pieces. One was democracy, the other was nationalism. Democracy meant the elected leaders, the parliament and the prime minister should rule, not the Shah. And nationalism meant Iran should be able to control its own resources, which in the case of Iran means oil. So with the unanimous vote of the Iranian parliament, Mossadegh led the drive and nationalized Iran's oil industry. That set the outside world into a panic. The oil had been completely owned by a British company that was in turn mainly owned by the British government. The US government was also intimately involved, as were large American corporations. The idea of a Middle Eastern country nationalizing its resources and keeping the profits for itself rather than sending them to another country was something the outside world felt completely intolerable. And in the summer of 1953, the United States sent a CIA team to Iran. The mission was destroy this incipient democracy and replace it with a dictatorial regime that will give us the oil we want.
I gained such an incredible understanding and really grew so much over the years. I ended up going on a second deployment to Kuwait, serving in Congress now for 7 years, really focused on national security, on foreign policy. I've served on the Foreign Affairs Committee, on the Armed Services Committee, on the Homeland Security Committee, really understanding the implications of the decisions both that Congress does and does not make, and the decisions that the President and Commander-in-Chief makes.
And then I think when we get up to the invasion of Iraq, I remember that so vividly myself, all the bad things that have come out of our invasion of Iraq were predicted. People were saying all of this was going to happen. Nobody can get up and say these were unpredicted consequences. They were consequences that you might have wished to ignore because you weren't listening to people who were talking outside of your own box. But nothing, no side effect, no terrible long-term effect, including the creation of ISIS, that came out of our invasion of Iraq was unpredicted. It's just that we didn't listen to the people who were saying something that we didn't want to hear. And I think this is a classic American problem. There's no limit in Washington to how many times you can be wrong before you are finally judged not qualified to be a commentator on television or a deputy assistant secretary of something. And the opposite is actually true. Those that are right never get a chance to come in and participate in the decisions of power.
We really need to have some structural changes. And I think where we begin, it's just my opinion, we have to come home. We have about 800 bases in 70 countries. We have to end this madness as assuming that America has the right and the obligation to rule the world. That is a fantasy, and it needs to be dispensed with, because what's happening is it is causing a diminution of our ability to be able to meet the practical aspirations of the American people for health care, for education, for good-paying jobs, for a clean environment, and all those things that have been part of what we once referred to as the American dream are being sacrificed to this notion that somehow we have the obligation to rule the world.
In 1980, President Carter, pushed by his national security advisor, Mr. Brzezinski, pronounced what became known as the Carter Doctrine. It has to do with the Persian Gulf. That was when we identified the Persian Gulf as an area of extraordinary national security importance to the United States that we would defend even militarily if necessary. We did that for two reasons. Number one, to keep the Soviet Union out of the Persian Gulf region, and number two, to protect vital supplies of energy that we needed. Today, there is no Soviet Union, and we don't get our vital supplies of energy from the Persian Gulf. So the reasons that we identified the Persian Gulf as essential to our security have evaporated, but yet we're continuing to crowd the Persian Gulf with warships, essentially hoping to spark some kind of an incident. We don't need to be there anymore, and transitioning to another kind of energy future is another reason why we can pull ourselves out of that part of the world where our presence only undermines our own security while weakening the stability of the countries we claim to be protecting.
The young man's more often in that picture on atop the television, and a picture of Kennedy and a picture of the Pope or Christ on the other side of the wall. And I saw this, and I went and picked up these pictures, and it was like a litany over and over and over of people who love the fact that their son was serving, who believe in the country. I come from a family of people who served in the military. And yet, this faith, this belief in America is just getting trashed by people who think it's some kind of a game of nations that you can just, do whatever you want, zap anybody you want, bomb any country you want, kill anyone you want, and then, do it in the name of heaven, you can justify it in the end. We need a fundamental change. And one of the reasons why I think Tulsi Gabbard's candidacy is so important is because she's raising those kind of questions.
What really explains why we have no basis for peace in the political movements of America that can resist this fight that manifests itself so unanimously inside of Congress?
It's sad that we are in a place where standing for peace requires courage. That I think you mentioned, Dennis, as that vote was about to take place, there was just an air of fear in the air. That people were concerned about, well, if I don't do this, how will I be criticized, or political ramifications, or one thing or the other. And I think it's even gotten worse, exponentially so today. So I would point to, look, there's an incredible amount of influence that the foreign policy establishment and the military-industrial complex has in Washington that, as has been pointed out, crosses over both parties. No matter which way the political winds blow, left or right, that we don't see a real change in the positions of leaders in Washington. I think because there's a lot of money involved. When you look at the amounts of contributions being made to members on the Armed Services Committee in particular, coming from big defense contractors, you see how large that number is, and you start to think about, well, how does that figure into those decisions that they're making? What lobbyists are giving them phone calls before they take a really critical and important vote? Washington is very much, unfortunately, like high school. It's about popularity. It's about who's cool, who gets invited to the nice parties. If you're not on the guest list, you better watch out. You've become one of the uncool kids at high school. You've got all the different cliques, and they all, in Hawaii, we call it talk stink. You talk stink about each other. If you are one of those who dares to challenge this establishment groupthink view that has been perpetuating these regime change wars and these follow-on nation building missions without ever thinking or asking the most basic question, which is, how does this serve the interests of our country? Is it making our country more safe or not? If we ask these basic questions time and time and time again, as we've seen thousands of American lives lost, tens of thousands more of our men and women coming home injured, millions of lives of people across the Middle East who have been killed as a result of these wars, the trillions of our taxpayer dollars being spent, and yet no one is asking the question, after all of this, are we more safe? Are we in a better place as a country? Is the quality of life of the American people across the country in a superior place? the answer to all of these questions is no.
Members of Congress are lied to all the time. When I started in Congress, one of the first things, you sign a piece of paper that says you will not divulge any classified information. It's actually, the only way you get into a meeting, a classified meeting, is to sign that. At the beginning of every Congress, you have to sign that. And so I did that the first Congress. I signed it, the first Congress I was in. And of course, you go to the classified meetings, and they lie to you. But you can't talk about how they lied to you because you're breaking the oath that you took that you won't divulge anything that was said in the meeting. So then the administration will leak a characterization of the meeting. And you can't refute it because you can take a stand on your own apart from that, but you cannot refer to what was said in that meeting. And this happens all the time.
Soleimani, a little bit about the Sunni-Shia balance in that part of the world. You all know that the Shia world is centered in Iran, and the other major Shia majority country, it's Iraq. So, Iran has a vital interest, more even than we do, in crushing ISIS and Al-Qaeda related groups, because a fundamental principle of those groups is kill every Shia. So that certainly gives Iran a certain reason to want to fight those kinds of currents in Iraq and in Syria. That's why Soleimani was a great hero in Iran. He is the greatest ISIS killer of all time. But, as you just heard, we've focused away from ISIS. We're actually not fighting against ISIS anymore. The way to crush terrorism in the Middle East is to build up strong states, strong central governments that control their territories and have armies. We are fighting against that. We don't want strong, stable states, because those that are going to emerge are not going to be subservient to our will. A stable Iraq under the government it has now, a stable Iran under the government it has now, a stable Syria under the government it has now would be great tools in fighting radical extremism. But we oppose that because those governments would express the will of their people, and that's not the will that we want them to express. Their crimes are defiance against the United States. And we consider that to be a greater crime than all that ISIS and Al-Qaeda have done to hurt us. In foreign policy, a president can really make a change. A president can really reorient this country, as we've seen already with the clumsy efforts of our president. Look what the mess he has gotten us into. Look where he's brought us. I'm telling you, foreign policy is the place where a president can make a dramatic difference in a way that no president will ever be able to do in the next 4 years in domestic policy. So I hope that leads some people to think that if we really want to change this country, there's one way it can be done simply by electing a new president. And that means changing completely the way America faces the rest of the world. And that would be one of the most profound changes that we could possibly make to bring us back to being the country that we once dreamed we wanted to be.
Thank you. This comes down to leadership. This is really the question before all of you as voters, as you head towards Election Day here in New Hampshire on February 11th. Understanding the responsibility that you have not only as individual voters to cast your vote, but what kind of message you will send to the nation as a first in the nation state. And I think very clearly laid out this evening is the importance of that role and responsibility that the Commander-in-Chief has, and how necessary it is that we have a Commander-in-Chief who exercises foresight, who has experience and understanding in these areas of national security and foreign policy, who's able to look to these decisions that have made throughout our nation's history and has seen how those decisions have actually undermined the interests of Americans all across this country and have undermined our own national security interests. I'm grateful to be able to be here and to share this stage with these gentlemen, to be able to bring these issues to the forefront before you make this decision, and offer to you that I bring that experience, yes, serving as a soldier for almost 17 years, of being deployed to the Middle East twice, of understanding very clearly the cost and the consequences of these decisions, both on human lives, on our taxpayer dollars, these resources that still today, as we are sitting here, we'll be in this room for about 2 hours by the time we walk out the door. In those 2 hours that we are here, we will have seen $11 million go to Afghanistan alone. $11 million in just 2 hours that we're gathered here tonight, going to prop up a corrupt government in Afghanistan and line the pockets of big defense contractors and consultants, with nobody understanding the answer to the question, for what? What are we trying to accomplish? What does quote unquote victory look like? How long will we have to keep doing this? How much longer will we see more and more lives lost? How much longer will we see our hard-earned taxpayer dollars being taken out of our schools, being taken out of our rural community health centers, being taken out of our ability to really serve the very urgent and pressing needs of people and communities all across this country? The experience that I've had in Congress now for 7 going on 8 years has given me a depth and understanding, really truly, of the cost and consequences of these decisions, understanding our Constitution and the role that Congress and the President has to make, that have prepared me to walk in on day one to fulfill that responsibility, to serve you, to serve our country as Commander-in-Chief, and to give you the peace of mind that we will end these long-standing regime change wars, the follow-on nation-building missions that happen, work to end this new Cold War that we're in with ratcheting up tensions between the United States and nuclear-armed countries like Russia and China, end this nuclear arms race that's making the world less safe, taking more money out of our pockets, and instead redirect those dollars and those resources really towards serving the urgent and pressing needs that we have right here at home. Thank you so much for your time this evening, and thanks to my colleagues here for joining us.